Section 5 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens, Chapter 9 and 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, Chapter 9. Sissy's Progress. Sissy Jupe had not an easy time of it between Mr. M. Coketown and Mrs. Gradgrind, and was not without strong impulses in the first months of her probation to run away. It hailed facts all day long so very hard, and life in general was open to her as such a closely ruled ciphering book, that assuredly she would have run away, but for only one restraint. It is lamentable to think of, but this restraint was the result of no arithmetical process, was self-imposed in defiance of all calculation, and went dead against any table of probabilities that any actuary would have drawn up from the premises. The girl believed that her father had not deserted her. She lived in the hope that he would come back, and in the faith that he would be made the happier by her remaining where she was. The wretched ignorance with which Jupe clung to this consolation, rejecting the superior comfort of knowing, on a sound arithmetical basis, that her father was an unnatural vagabond, filled Mr. Gradgrind with pity. Yet what was to be done? M. Coketown reported that she had a very dense head for figures, that, once possessed with a general idea of the globe, she took the smallest conceivable interest in its exact measurements, that she was extremely slow in the acquisition of dates, unless some pitiful incident happened to be concerned therewith, that she would burst into tears on being required, by the mental process, immediately to name the cost of 247 muslin caps at 14 halfpenny, that she was as low down in the school as low could be, that, after 8 weeks of induction into the elements of political economy, she had only yesterday been set right by a prattler 3 feet high for returning to the question, "What is the first principle of this science?" The absurd answer, "To do unto others as I would that they should do unto me." Mr. Gradgrind observed, shaking his head, that all this was very bad, that it showed the necessity of infinite grinding at the mill of knowledge, as per system, schedule, blue book, report, and tabular statements, A to Z, and that Jupe must be kept to it. So Jupe was kept to it, and became low-spirited, but no wiser. "It would be a fine thing to be you, Miss Louisa," she said one night, when Louisa had endeavoured to make her perplexities for next day something clearer to her. "Do you think so?" "I should know so much, Miss Louisa. All that is difficult to me now would be so easy then." "You might not be better for it, Sissy." Sissy submitted after a little hesitation. "I should not be the worse, Miss Louisa." To which Louisa answered, "Oh, I don't know that." There had been so little communication between these two, both because life at Stone Lodge went monotonously round like a piece of machinery which discouraged human interference, and because of the prohibition relative to Sissy's past career, that they were still almost strangers. Sissy, with her dark eyes wonderingly directed to Louisa's face, was uncertain whether to say more or to remain silent. "You are more useful to my mother and more pleasant with me than I can ever be," Louisa resumed. "You are pleasanter to yourself than I am to myself." "But if you please, Miss Louisa," Sissy pleaded, "I am, oh, so stupid." Louisa, with a brighter laugh than usual, told her she would be wiser by and by. "Oh, you don't know," said Sissy, half crying, "what a stupid girl I am. All through school hours I make mistakes. Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild call me up over and over again regularly to make mistakes. I can't help them. They seem to come natural to me." "Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild never make any mistakes themselves, I suppose, Sissy?" "Oh, no," she eagerly returned. "They know everything." "Well, tell me some of your mistakes." "I am almost ashamed," said Sissy with reluctance. "But to-day, for instance, Mr. M'Choakumchild was explaining to us about natural prosperity." "National, I think it must have been," observed Louisa. Yes, it was. But isn't it the same?" she timidly asked. "You had better say national, as he said so," returned Louisa, with her dry reserve. "National prosperity. And he said now, this schoolroom is a nation, and in this nation there are 50 millions of money. Isn't this a prosperous nation? Girl number 20, isn't this a prosperous nation? And ain't you in a thriving state?" "What did you say?" asked Louisa. "Miss Louisa, I said I didn't know. I thought I couldn't know whether it was a prosperous nation or not, and whether I was in a thriving state or not, unless I knew who had got the money, and whether any of it was mine. But that had nothing to do with it. It was not in the figures at all," said Sissy, wiping her eyes. "Oh, that was a great mistake of yours," observed Louisa. "Yes, Miss Louisa, I know it was now. Then Mr. M'Choakumchild said he would try me again, and he said this schoolroom is an immense town, and in it there are 1 million of inhabitants, and only 25 are starved to death in the streets in the course of a year. What is your remark on that proportion?" And my remark was, for I couldn't think of a better one, that I thought it must be just as hard upon those who were starved, whether the others were 1 million or 1 million, and that was wrong too. "Of course it is." "Then Mr. M'Choakumchild said he would try me once more, and he said, oh, here are the stutterings." "Statistics?" said Louisa. "Yes, Miss Louisa. They always remind me of stutterings, and that's another of my mistakes, of accidents upon the sea. And I find, Mr. M'Choakumchild said, that in a given time 100,000 persons went to sea on long voyages, and only 500 of them were drowned or burnt to death. What is the percentage? And I said, Miss—" Here Sissy fairly sobbed, as confessing with extreme contrition to her greatest error. "I said it was nothing." "Nothing, Sissy?" "Nothing, miss, to the relations and friends of the people who were killed." "I shall never learn," said Sissy. "And the worst of it is, that although my poor father wished me to so much to learn, and although I'm anxious to learn because he wished me to, I'm afraid I don't like it." Louisa stood looking at the pretty modest head, as it drooped abashed before her, until it was raised again to glance at her face. Then she asked, "Did your father know so much himself that he wished you to be well taught too, Sissy?" Sissy hesitated before replying, and so plainly showed her sense that they were entering on forbidden ground, that Louisa added, "No one hears us, and if any one did, I'm sure no harm could be found in such an innocent question." "No, Miss Louisa," answered Sissy, upon this encouragement, shaking her head. "Father knows very little indeed. It's as much as he can do to write, and it's more than people in general can do to read his writing, though it is plain to me." "And your mother?" "Father says she was quite a scholar. She died when I was born. She was—" Sissy made the terrible communication nervously. "She was a dancer." Did your father love her? Louisa asked these questions with a strong, wild, wandering interest peculiar to her, an interest gone astray like a banished creature and hiding in solitary places. Oh, yes, as dearly as he loves me. Father loved me first for her sake. He carried me about with him when I was quite a baby. We have never been asunder from that time. Yet he leaves you now, Sissy? Only for my good. Nobody understands him as I do. Nobody knows him as I do. When he left me for my good, he never would have left me for his own. I know he was almost broken-hearted with the trial. He will not be happy for a single minute till he comes back. Tell me more about him, said Louisa. I will never ask you again. Where did you live? Oh, we travelled about the country and had no fixed place to live in. Father's a... Sissy whispered the awful word. A clown. To make the people laugh, said Louisa, with a nod of intelligence. Yes, but they wouldn't laugh sometimes, and then father cried. Lately they very often wouldn't laugh, and he used to come home despairing. Father's not like most. Those who didn't know him as well as I do, and didn't love him as dearly as I do, might believe he was not quite right. Sometimes they played tricks upon him. They never knew how he felt them, and shrunk up when he was alone with me. He was far, far timider than they thought. And you were his comfort through everything? She nodded, with the tears rolling down her face. I hope so. And father said I was. It was because he grew so scared and trembling, and because he felt himself to be a poor, weak, ignorant, helpless man. Those used to be his words, that he wanted me so much to know a great deal and be different from him. I used to read to him to cheer his courage, and he was very fond of that. They were wrong books. I am never to speak of them here, but we didn't know there was any harm in them. And he liked them, said Louisa, with her searching gaze on Sissy all the time. Oh, very much. They kept him many times from what did him real harm, and often of a night he used to forget all his troubles, and wondering whether the Sultan would let the lady go on with the story, or would have her head cut off before it was finished. And your father was always kind to the last? Asked Louisa, contravening the great principle, and wondering very much. Always, always, returned Sissy, clasping her hands. Kinder than I can tell. He was angry only one night, and that was not to me, but Merrylegs, she whispered the awful fact, is his performing dog. Why was he angry with the dog? Louisa demanded. Father, soon after they came home from performing, told Merrylegs to jump up on the backs of the two chairs and stand across them, which is one of his tricks. He looked at father and didn't do it at once. Everything of father's had gone wrong that night, and he hadn't pleased the public at all. He cried out that the very dog knew he was failing, and had no compassion on him. Then he beat the dog, and I was frightened and said, Father, Father, pray don't hurt the creature who is so fond of you. Oh, heaven forgive you, father, stop. And he stopped, and the dog was bloody, and father lay down crying on the floor with the dog in his arms, and the dog licked his face. Louisa saw that she was sobbing, and going to her, kissed her, took her hand, and sat down beside her. Finish by telling me how your father left you, Sissy. Now that I have asked you so much, tell me the end. The blame, if there is any blame, is mine, not yours. My dear Miss Louisa, said Sissy, covering her eyes and sobbing yet, I came home from school that afternoon and found poor father just come home too from the booth, and he sat rocking himself over the fire, as if he was in pain, and I said, Have you hurt yourself, father? As he did sometimes, like they all did, and he said, A little, my darling. and when I came to stoop down and look up at his face, I saw he was crying. The more I spoke to him, the more he hid his face, and at first he shook all over and said nothing but my darling and my love. Here Tom came lounging in, and stared at the two with a coolness not particularly savouring of interest in anything but himself, and not much of that at present. "I'm asking Sissy a few questions, Tom," observed his sister. "You have no occasion to go away, but don't interrupt us for a moment, Tom, dear." "Oh, very well," returned Tom. "Only father has brought old Bounderby home, and I want you to come into the drawing-room, because if you come, there's a good chance of old Bounderby's asking me to dinner, and if you don't, there's none." "I'll come directly." "I'll wait for you," said Tom, "to make sure." Sissy resumed in a lower voice. "At last poor father said that he had given no satisfaction again, and never did give any satisfaction now, and that he was a shame and a disgrace, and I should have done better without him all along. I said all the affectionate things to him that came into my heart, and presently he was quiet, and I sat down by him and told him all about the school and everything that had been said and done there. When I had no more left to tell, he put his arms round my neck and kissed me a great many times. Then he asked me to fetch some of the stuff he had used for the little hurt he had had, and to get it at the best place, which was at the other end of the town from there, and then, after kissing me again, he let me go. When I had gone downstairs, I turned back that I might be a little bit more company to him yet, and looked in at the door and said, 'Father dear, shall I take Merrylegs?' Father shook his head and said, 'No, Sissy, no. Take nothing that's known to be mine, my darling.' And I left him sitting by the fire. Then the thought must have come upon him, poor, poor father, of going away to try something for my sake, for when I came back, he was gone." "I say, look sharp for old Bounderby, Loo," Tom remonstrated. "There's nothing more to tell, Miss Louisa. I kept the 9 oils ready for him, and I know he will come back. Every letter that I see in Mr. Gradgrind's hands takes my breath away and blinds my eyes, for I think it comes from father, or from Mr. Sleary about father. Mr. Sleary promised to write as soon as ever father should be heard of, and I trust him to keep his word." "Do look sharp for old Bounderby, Loo," said Tom, with an impatient whistle. "He'll be off if you don't look sharp." After this, whenever Sissy dropped a curtsey to Mr. Gradgrind in the presence of his family, and said in a faltering way, "I beg your pardon, sir, for being troublesome, but have you had any letter yet about me?" Louisa would suspend the occupation of the moment, whatever it was, and look for a reply as earnestly as Sissy did, and when Mr. Gradgrind regularly answered, "No, Jupe, nothing of the sort," the trembling of Sissy's lip would be repeated in Louisa's face, and her eyes would follow Sissy with compassion to the door. Mr. Gradgrind usually improved these occasions by remarking, when she was gone, that if Jupe had been properly trained from an early age, she would have demonstrated to herself, on sound principles, the baselessness of these fantastic hopes. Yet it did seem, though not to him, for he saw nothing of it, as if fantastic hope could take as strong a hold as fact. This observation must be limited exclusively to his daughter. As to Tom, he was becoming that not unprecedented triumph of calculation which is usually at work on number 1. As to Mrs. Gradgrind, if she said anything on the subject, she would come a little way out of her wrappers, like a feminine dormouse, and say, "Good gracious, bless me, how my poor head is vexed and worried by that girl Jupe's so perseveringly asking over and over again about her tiresome letters. Upon my word and honour, I seem to be fated and destined and ordained to live in the midst of things that I am never to hear the last of. It really is a most extraordinary circumstance that appears as if I never was to hear the last of anything." At about this point Mr. Gradgrind's eye would fall upon her, and under the influence of that wintry piece of fact she would become torpid again. Chapter 10. Stephen Blackpool. I entertain a weak idea that the English people are as hard worked as any people upon whom the sun shines. I acknowledge to this ridiculous idiosyncrasy as a reason why I would give them a little more play. In the hardest working part of Coketown, in the innermost fortifications of that ugly citadel where nature was as strongly bricked out as killing airs and gases were bricked in, at the heart of that labyrinth of narrow courts upon courts, and close streets upon streets, which had come into existence piecemeal, every piece in a violent hurry for some one man's purpose, and the whole an unnatural family, shouldering and trampling and pressing one another to death. In that last close nook of this great exhausted receiver, where the chimneys, for want of air to make a draught, were built in an immense variety of stunted and crooked shapes, as though every house put out a sign of the kind of people who might be expected to be born in it, among the multitude of Coketown generically called the Hands, a race who would have found more favour with some people if Providence had seen fit to make them only hands, or, like the lower creatures of the seashore, only hands and stomachs, lived a certain Stephen Blackpool, 40 years of age. Stephen looked older, but he had had a hard life. It is said that every life has its roses and thorns. There seemed, however, to have been a misadventure or mistake in Stephen's case, whereby somebody else had become possessed of his roses, and he had become possessed of that same somebody else's thorns in addition to his own. He had known, to use his words, a peck of trouble. He was usually called Old Stephen in a kind of rough homage to the fact. A rather stooping man, with a knitted brow, a pondering expression of face, and a hard-looking head sufficiently capacious on which his iron-grey hair lay long and thin, Old Stephen might have passed for a particularly intelligent man in his condition, yet he was not. He took no place among those remarkable hands who, piecing together their broken intervals of leisure through many years, had mastered difficult sciences and acquired a knowledge of most unlikely things. He held no station among the hands who could make speeches and carry on debates. Thousands of his compeers could talk much better than he at any time. He was a good power loom weaver, and a man of perfect integrity. What more he was, or what else he had in him, if anything, let him show for himself. The lights in the great factories, which looked, when they were illuminated, like fairy palaces, or the travellers by express trains said so, were all extinguished, and the bells had rung for knocking off for the night, and had ceased again, and the hands, men and women, boy and girl, were clattering home. Old Stephen was standing in the street, with the odd sensation upon him which the stoppage of the machinery always produced, the sensation of its having worked and stopped in his own head. "Yet I don't see Rachael still," said he. It was a wet night, and many groups of young women passed him, with their shawls drawn over their bare heads and held close under their chins to keep the rain out. He knew Rachael well, for a glance at Any one of those groups was sufficient to show him that she was not there. At last there was no more to come, and then he turned away, saying in a tone of disappointment, "Why, then, I have missed her." But he had not gone the length of 3 streets when he saw another of the shawled figures in advance of him, at which he looked so keenly that perhaps its mere shadow, indistinctly reflected on the wet pavement, if he could have seen it without the figure itself, moving along from lamp to lamp, brightening and fading as it went, would have been enough to tell him who was there. Making his pace at once much quicker and much softer, he darted on until he was very near this figure, then fell into his former walk and called, "Rachael!" She turned, being then in the brightness of a lamp, and raising her hood a little, showed a quiet oval face, dark and rather delicate, irradiated by a pair of very gentle eyes, and further set off by the perfect order of her shining black hair. It was not a face in its first bloom. She was a woman 35 years of age. "Ah, lad, 'tis thou." When she had said this, with a smile which would have been quite expressed, though nothing of her had been seen but her pleasant eyes, she replaced her hood again, and they went on together. "I thought thou was ahind me, Rachael." "No." "Early to night, lass?" "Times I'm a little early, Stephen, times a little late. I'm never to be counted on going home." "Nor going t'other way neither, it seems to me, Rachael." "No, Stephen." He looked at her with some disappointment in his face, but with a respectful and patient conviction that she must be right in whatever she did. The expression was not lost upon her. She laid her hand lightly on his arm a moment, as if to thank him for it. "We are such true friends, lad, and such old friends, and getting to be such old folk now." "No, Rachael, thou'rt as young as ever thou wast." "One of us would be puzzled how to get old, Stephen, without t'other getting so too, both being alive," she answered, laughing. "But anyways, we're such old friends, that to hide a word of honest truth fro one another would be a sin and a pity. 'Tis better not to walk too much farther. Times, yes, 'twould be hard indeed if 'twas not to be at all," she said with a cheerfulness she sought to communicate to him. "'Tis hard anyways, Rachael." "Try to think not, and 'twill seem better." "I've tried a long time, and 'tain't got better. But thou'rt right to make folk talk even of thee. Thou hast been that to me, Rachael. Through so many year thou hast done me so much good, and heartened of me in that cheering way, that thy word is law to me. Ah, lass, and a bright good law, better than some real ones." "Oh, never fret about them, Stephen," she answered quickly, and not without an anxious glance at his face. "Let the laws be." "Yes," he said, with a slow nod or two. "Let 'em be. Let everything be. Let all sorts alone. 'Tis a muddle, and that's all." "Always a muddle?" said Rachael, with another gentle touch upon his arm, as if to recall him out of the thoughtfulness in which he was biting the long ends of his loose neckerchief as he walked along. The touch had its instantaneous effect. He let them fall. Turning a smiling face upon her, he said, as he broke into a good-humoured laugh, "Ay, Rachael, less. All is a muddle. That's where I stick. I come to the muddle many times and again, and I never get beyond it." They had walked some distance, and were near their own homes. The woman's was the first reach. It was in one of the many small streets for which the favourite undertaker, who turned a handsome sum out of the poor ghastly pomp of the neighbourhood, kept a black ladder, in order that those who had done their daily groping up and down the narrow streets might slide out of this working world by the windows. She stopped at the corner, and putting her hand in his, wished him good night. "Good night, dear lass, good night." She went with her neat figure and her sober, womanly step down the dark street, and he stood looking after her until she turned into one of the small houses. There was not a flutter of her coarse shawl, perhaps, but had its interest in this man's eyes; not a tone of her voice, but had its echo in his innermost heart. When she was lost to his view, he pursued his homeward way, glancing up sometimes to the sky, where the clouds were sailing fast and wildly. But they were broken now, and the rain had ceased, and the moon shone, looking down the high chimneys of Coketown on the deep furnaces below, and casting titanic shadows of the steam engines at rest upon the walls where they were lodged. The man seemed to have brightened with the night as he went on. His home, in such another street as the first, saving that it was narrower, was over a little shop. How it came to pass that any people found it worth their while to sell or buy the wretched little toys mixed up in its window with cheap newspapers and pork (there was a leg to be raffled for tomorrow night) matters not here. He took his end of candle from a shelf, lighted it at another end of candle on the counter without disturbing the mistress of the shop, who was asleep in her little room, and went upstairs into his lodging. It was a room not unacquainted with the black ladder under various tenants, but as neat at present as such a room could be. A few books and writings were on an old bureau in a corner. The furniture was decent and sufficient, and though the atmosphere was tainted, the room was clean. Going to the hearth, he set the candle down upon the round three-legged table standing there. He stumbled against something as he recoiled, looking down at it. It raised itself up into the form of a woman in sitting attitude. "Heaven's mercy, woman!" he cried, falling farther off from the figure. "Hast thou come back again?" Such a woman! A disabled, drunken creature, barely able to preserve her sitting posture by steadying herself with one begrimed hand on the floor, while the other was so purposeless as trying to push away her tangled hair from her face that it only blinded her the more with the dirt upon it. A creature so foul to look at, in her tatters, stains, and splashes, but so much fouler than that in her moral infamy, that it was a shameful thing even to see her. After an impatient oath or two, and some stupid clawing at herself with a hand not necessary to her support, she got her hair away from her eyes sufficiently to obtain a sight of him. Then she sat swaying her body to and fro, and making gestures with her unnerved arm, which seemed intended as the accompaniment to a fit of laughter, though her face was stolid and drowsy. "Ithlath, what you're there?" Some hoarse sounds meant for this came mockingly out of her at last, and her head dropped forward on her breast. "Back again?" she screeched after some minutes, as if he had that moment said it. "Yes, and back again, ever and ever so often. Back, yes, back, why not?" Roused by the unmeaning voice with which she cried it out, she scrambled up and stood supporting herself with her shoulders against the wall, dangling in one hand by the string of a dunghill fragment of a bonnet, and trying to look scornfully at him. "I'll sell thee off again, I'll sell thee off again, I'll sell thee off a score of times," she cried, with something between a furious menace and an effort at defiant dance. "Come awa' from the bed." He was sitting on the side of it with his face hidden in his hands. "Come awa' from 't. 'Tis mine, and I've a right to it." As she staggered to it, he avoided her with a shudder, and passed till his face was hidden, to the opposite end of the room. She threw herself upon the bed heavily, and soon was snoring hard. He sunk into a chair and moved but once all that night. It was to throw a covering over her, as if his hands were not enough to hide her, even in the darkness. End of section 5 of Hard Times.
Section 6 of Hard Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosalind Wills. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 6, Chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11. No Way Out. The fairy palaces burst into illumination before pale morning showed the monstrous serpents of smoke trailing themselves over Coketown. A clattering of clogs upon the pavement, a rapid ringing of bells, and all the melancholy mad elephants, polished and oiled up for the day's monotony, were at their heavy exercise again. Stephen bent over his loom, quiet, watchful, and steady. A special contrast, as every man was in the forest of looms where Stephen worked, to the crashing, smashing, tearing piece of mechanism at which he laboured. Never fear, good people of an anxious turn of mind, that art will consign nature to oblivion. Set anywhere, side by side, the work of God and the work of man, and the former, even though it be a troop of hands of very small account, will gain in dignity from the comparison. So many hundred hands in this mill, so many hundred horse steam power. It is known to the force of a single pound weight what the engine will do, but not all the calculators of the national debt can tell me the capacity for good or evil, for love or hatred, for patriotism or discontent, for the decomposition of virtue into vice or the reverse at any single moment in the soul of one of these its quiet servants, with the composed faces and the regulated actions. There is no mystery in it. There is an unfathomable mystery in the meanest of them, forever. Supposing we were to reverse our arithmetic for material objects, and to govern these awful unknown quantities by other means. The day grew strong and showed itself outside, even against the flaming lights within. The lights were turned out, and the work went on. The rain fell, and the smoke serpents, submissive to the curse of all that tribe, trailed themselves upon the earth. In the waste yard outside, the steam from the escape pipe, the litter of barrels and old iron, the shining heaps of coals, the ashes everywhere, were shrouded in a veil of mist and rain. The work went on until the noon bell rang. More clattering upon the pavements, the looms and wheels and hands all out of gear for an hour. Stephen came out of the hot mill into the damp wind and cold wet streets, haggard and worn. He turned from his own class and his own quarter, taking nothing but a little bread as he walked along, towards the hill on which his principal employer lived, in a red house with black outside shutters, green inside blinds, a black street door up 2 white steps, Bounderby, in letters very like himself, upon a brazen plate, and a round brazen door handle underneath it, like a brazen full stop. Mr. Bounderby was at his lunch, so Stephen had expected. Would his servant say that one of the hands begged leave to speak to him? Message in return requiring name of such hand. Stephen Blackpool. There was nothing troublesome against Stephen Blackpool. Yes, he might come in. Stephen Blackpool in the parlour. Mr. Bounderby, whom he just knew by sight, at lunch on chop and sherry. Mrs. Sparsit netting at the fireside, in a side-saddle attitude, with one foot in a cotton stirrup. It was a part at once of Mrs. Sparsit's dignity and service not to lunch. She supervised the meal officially, but implied that in her own stately person she considered lunch a weakness. "Now, Stephen," said Mr. Bounderby, "what's the matter with you?" Stephen made a bow. "Not a servile one. These hands will never do that. Lord bless you, sir, you'll never catch them at that, if they have been with you 20 years. And, as a complimentary toilet for Mrs. Sparsit, tucked his neckerchief ends into his waistcoat. "Now, you know," said Mr. Bounderby, taking some sherry, "we've never had any difficulty with you, and you've never been one of the unreasonable ones. You don't expect to be set up in a coach and six, and to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon, as a good many of them do." Mr. Bounderby always represented this to be the sole, immediate, and direct object of any hand who was not entirely satisfied. "And therefore I know already that you have not come here to make a complaint. Now you know, I am certain of that beforehand." No, sir. Sure, I ha' no come for nowt o' the kind. Mr. Bounderby seemed agreeably surprised, notwithstanding his previous strong conviction. Very well, he returned. You're a steady hand, and I was not mistaken. Now let me hear what it's all about. As it's not that, let me hear what it is. What have you got to say? Out with it, lad. Stephen happened to glance toward Mrs. Sparsit. I can go, Mr. Bounderby, if you wish it, said that self-sacrificing lady, making a feint of taking her foot out of the stirrup. Mr. Bounderby stayed her by holding a mouthful of chop in suspension before swallowing it, and putting out his left hand. Then, withdrawing his hand and swallowing his mouthful of chop, he said to Stephen, Now you know, this good lady is a born lady, a high lady. You are not to suppose, because she keeps my house for me, that she hasn't been very high up the tree, up at the top of the tree. Now, if you have got anything to say that can't be said before a born lady, this lady will leave the room. If what you have got to say can be said before a born lady, this lady will stay where she is. Sir, I hope I never had nowt to say not fitting for a born lady to hear, seeing I were born mysen, was the reply, accompanied with a slight flush. Very well, said Mr. Bounderby, pushing away his plate and leaning back. Fire away. I ha' come, Stephen began, raising his eyes from the floor after a moment's consideration, to ask you your advice. I need it o'ermuch. I were married on Easter Monday 19 years sin, long and dree. She were a young lass, pretty enow, wi' good accounts of herseln. Well, she went bad, soon. Not along o' me. God knows I were not an unkind husband to her. I have heard all this before, said Mr. Bounderby. She took to drinking, left off working, sold the furniture, pawned the clothes, and played old gooseberry. I were patient wi' her. The more fool you, I think, said Mr. Bounderby in confidence to his wine-glass. I were very patient wi' her. I tried to wean her fro't o'er and o'er again. I tried this, I tried that, I tried t'other. I ha' gone home many's the time and found all vanished as I had in the world, and her without a sense left to bless herseln, lying on bare ground. I ha' done it not once, not twice, 20 time. Every line in his face deepened as he said it, and put in its affecting evidence of the suffering he had undergone. From bad to worse, from worse to worsen. She left me. She disgraced herseln every ways, bitter and bad. She come back. She come back. She come back. What could I do to hinder her? I ha' walked the streets nights long ere ever I'd go home. I ha' gone to the brig minded to fling myseln o'er and have no more on't. I ha' bore that much, that I were old when I were young. Mrs. Sparsit, easily ambling along with her netting needles, raised the Coriolanian eyebrows and shook her head, as much as to say, The great know trouble as well as the small. Please to turn your humble eye in my direction. I ha' paid her to keep away from me. These 5 year I ha' paid her. I ha' gotten decent futurals about me again. I ha' lived hard and sad, but not ashamed and fearful of the minutes o' my life. Last night I went home. There she lay upon my hearthstone. There she is! In the strength of his misfortune and the energy of his distress, he fired for the moment like a proud man. In another moment he stood as he had stood all the time, his usual stoop upon him, his pondering face addressed to Mr. Bounderby, with a curious expression on it, half shrewd, half perplexed, as if his mind were set upon unravelling something very difficult. His hat held tight in his left hand, which rested on his hip. His right arm, with a rugged propriety and force of action, very earnestly emphasizing what he said, not least so when it always paused, a little bent but not withdrawn, as he paused. I was acquainted with all this, you know, said Mr. Bounderby, except the last clause, long ago. It's a bad job, that's what it is. You had better have been satisfied as you were, and not have got married. However, it is too late to say that. Was it an unequal marriage, sir, in point of years? asked Mrs. Sparsit. You hear what this lady asks. Was it an unequal marriage in point of years, this unlucky job of yours? Said Mr. Bounderby. Not e'en so. I were 21 myseln. She were 20 but. Indeed, sir, said Mrs. Sparsit to her chief, with great placidity. I inferred from its being so miserable a marriage, that it was probably an unequal one in point of years. Mr. Bounderby looked very hard at the good lady in a sidelong way that had an odd sheepishness about it. He fortified himself with a little more sherry. Well, why don't you go on? He then asked, turning rather irritably on Stephen Blackpool. I ha' come to ask you, sir, how I am to be ridded of this woman. Stephen infused a yet deeper gravity into the mixed expression of his attentive face. Mrs. Sparsit uttered a gentle ejaculation, as having received a moral shock. 'What do you mean?' said Bounderby, getting up to lean his back against the chimney-piece. 'What are you talking about? You took her for better or for worse?' 'I must be ridden on her. I canna bear it no more. I ha' lived under it so long, for that I ha' hadden the pity and comforting words of the best lass living or dead. Haply but for her, I should have gone battering mad.' 'He wishes to be free to marry the female of whom he speaks, I fear, sir,' observed Mrs. Sparsit in an undertone, and much dejected by the immorality of the people. 'I do. The lady says what's right. I do. I were a comin' to't. I ha' read i' the papers that great folk, far fro' 'em all, I wishes 'em no hurt, are not bonded together for better for worse so fast, but that they can be set free fro' their misfort'nate marriages, and marry o'er again. When they dunnot agree, for that their tempers is ill sorted, they has rooms o' one kind and another in their houses, above a bit, and they can live asunders. We folk ha' only one room, and we can't. When that won't do, they ha' gowd another cash, and they can say, this for you and that for me, and they can go their separate ways. We can't. Spite o' all that, they can be set free for smaller wrongs than mine. So I mun be ridden of this woman, and I want to know how.' 'Know how?' returned Mr. Bounderby. 'If I do her any hurt, sir, there's a law to punish me.' 'Of course there is.' 'If I flee from her, there's a law to punish me.' 'Of course there is.' 'If I marry t'other dear lass, there's a law to punish me.' 'Of course there is.' 'If I was to live wi' her and not marry her, saying such a thing could be, which it never could or would in her so good, there's a law to punish me and every innocent child belonging to me.' 'Of course there is.' 'Now, in God's name,' said Stephen Blackpool, 'show me the law to help me.' 'There's a sanctity in this relation of life,' said Mr. Bounderby, 'and it must be kept up.' 'No, no, dunnot say that, sir. 'Tan't kept up that way. Not that way. 'Tis kept down that way. I'm a weaver. I were in a factory when a child, but I ha' got nine to see wi', and earn to hear wi'. I read in the papers every sizes, every sessions, and you read too, I know it, with dismay, how the supposed unpossibility o' ever getting unchained from one another at any price, on any terms, brings blood upon this land, and brings many common married folk to battle, murder, and sudden death. Let us ha' this right understood. Mine's a grievous case, and I want, if you will be so good, to know the law that helps me.' 'Now, I tell you what,' said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets, 'there is such a law.' Stephen, subsiding into his quiet manner, and never wandering in his attention, gave a nod. 'But it's not for you at all. It costs money. It costs a mint of money.' 'How much might that be?' Stephen calmly asked. 'Why, you'd have to go to a Doctors' Commons with a suit, and you'd have to go to a Court of Common Law with a suit, and you'd have to go to the House of Lords with a suit, and you'd have to get an Act of Parliament to enable you to marry again, and it would cost you, if it was a case of very plain sailing, I suppose from £1,000 to £1,500, said Mr. Bounderby. 'Perhaps twice the money.' 'There's no other law?' 'Certainly not.' 'Why then, sir,' said Stephen, turning white and motioning with that right hand of his, as if he gave everything to the four winds, ''tis a muddle. 'Tis just a muddle altogether, and the sooner I'm dead the better.' Mrs. Sparsit, again dejected by the impiety of the people. 'Pooh, pooh! Don't you talk nonsense, my good fellow,' said Mr. Bounderby, 'about things you don't understand, and don't you call the institutions of your country a muddle, or you'll get yourself into a real muddle one of these fine mornings. The institutions of your country are not your piecework, and the only thing you have got to do is to mind your piecework. You didn't take your wife for fast and for loose, but for better and for worse. If she has turned out worse, why, all we've got to say is, she might have turned out better.' ''Tis a muddle,' said Stephen, shaking his head as he moved to the door. ''Tis all a muddle.' 'Now, I'll tell you what,' Mr. Bounderby resumed, as a valedictory address. 'With what I shall call your unhallowed opinions, you have been quite shocking to this lady, who, as I have already told you, is a born lady, and who, as I have not already told you, has had her own marriage misfortunes to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds. Tens of thousands of pounds!' He repeated it with great relish. 'Now, you have always been a steady hand hitherto, but my opinion is, and so I tell you plainly, that you are turning into the wrong road. You have been listening to some mischievous stranger or other (they're always about), and the best thing you can do is to come out of that. Now, you know,' Here his countenance expressed marvellous acuteness. "I can see as far into a grindstone as another man, farther than a good many, perhaps, because I had my nose well kept to it when I was young. I see traces of the turtle soup and venison and gold spoon in this, yes I do," cried Mr. Bounderby, shaking his head with obstinate cunning. "By the Lord Harry, I do!" With a very different shake of his head, and deep sigh, Stephen said, "Thank you, sir. I wish you good day." So he left Mr. Bounderby swelling at his own portrait on the wall, as if he were going to explode himself into it, and Mrs. Sparsit still ambling on with her foot in her stirrup, looking quite cast down by the popular vices. Chapter 13. The Old Woman. Old Stephen descended the 2 white steps, shutting the black door with the brazen door-plate by the aid of the brazen full-stop, to which he gave a parting polish with the sleeve of his coat, observing that his hot hand clouded it. He crossed the street with his eyes bent upon the ground, and thus was walking sorrowfully away when he felt a touch upon his arm. It was not the touch he needed most at such a moment, the touch that could calm the wild waters of his soul as the uplifted hand of the sublimest love and patience could abate the raging of the sea. Yet it was a woman's hand too. It was an old woman, tall and shapely still, though withered by time, on whom his eyes fell when he stopped and turned. She was very cleanly and plainly dressed, had country mud upon her shoes, and was newly come from a journey. The flutter of her manner in the unwonted noise of the streets, the spare shawl carried unfolded on her arm, the heavy umbrella and little basket, the loose long-fingered gloves to which her hands were unused, all bespoke an old woman from the country, in her plain holiday clothes, come into Coketown on an expedition of rare occurrence. Remarking this at a glance with the quick observation of his class, Stephen Blackpool bent his attentive face, his face which, like the faces of many of his order, by dint of long working with eyes and hands in the midst of a prodigious noise, had acquired the concentrated look with which we are familiar in the countenances of the deaf, the better to hear what she asked him. "Pray, sir," said the old woman, "didn't I see you come out of that gentleman's house?" pointing back to Mr. Bounderby's. "I believe it was you, unless I have had the bad luck to mistake the person in following." "Yes, missus," returned Stephen, "it were me." "Have you—you'll excuse an old woman's curiosity—have you seen the gentleman?" "Yes, missus." "And how did he look, sir? Was he portly, bold, outspoken, and hearty?" As she straightened her own figure, and held up her head in adapting her action to her words, the idea crossed Stephen that he had seen this old woman before, and had not quite liked her. "Oh yes," he returned, observing her more attentively. "He were all that." "And healthy," said the old woman, "as the fresh wind?" "Yes," returned Stephen. "He were eating and drinking, as large and as loud as a hummel-bee." "Thank you," said the old woman, with infinite content. "Thank you." He certainly never had seen this old woman before, yet there was a vague remembrance in his mind, as if he had more than once dreamed of some old woman like her. She walked along at his side, and, gently accommodating himself to her humour, he said, Coketown was a busy place, was it not? To which she answered, "Aye, sure, dreadful busy." Then he said, she came from the country, he saw. To which she answered in the affirmative. "By Parliamentary, this morning. I came 40 mile by Parliamentary this morning, and I'm going back the same 40 mile this afternoon. I walked 9 mile to the station this morning, and if I find nobody on the road to give me a lift, I shall walk the 9 mile back to-night. That's pretty well, sir, at my age," said the chatty old woman, her eye brightening with exultation. "'Deed 'tis. Don't do it too often, missus." "No, no. Once a year," she answered, shaking her head. "I spend my savings, sir, once every year. I come regular, to tramp about the streets and see the gentleman." "Only to see him?" returned Stephen. "That's enough for me," she replied, with great earnestness and interest of manner. "I ask no more. I have been standing about on this side of the way to see that gentleman," turning her head back towards Mr. Bounderby's again. "Come out. But he's late this year, and I've not seen him. You came out instead. Now, if I am obliged to go back without a glimpse of him, I only want a glimpse. Well, I have seen you, and you have seen him, and I must make that do." Saying this, she looked at Stephen as if to fix his features in her mind, and her eye was not so bright as it had been. With a large allowance for difference of tastes, and with all submission to the patricians of Coketown, this seemed so extraordinary a source of interest to take so much trouble about, that it perplexed him. But they were passing the church now, and as his eye caught the clock, he quickened his pace. He was going to work, the old woman said, quickening hers too, quite easily. Yes, time was nearly out. On his telling her where he worked, the old woman became a more singular old woman than before. "An't you happy?" she asked him. "Why, there's almost nobody but has their troubles, missus," he answered evasively, because the old woman appeared to take it for granted that he would be very happy indeed, and he had not the heart to disappoint her. He knew that there was trouble enough in the world, and if the old woman had lived so long and could count upon his having so little, why so much the better for her and none the worse for him. "Aye, aye, you have your troubles at home, you mean," she said. "Times, just now and then," he answered slightly. "But working under such a gentleman, they don't follow you to the factory." "No, no, they didn't follow him there," said Stephen. "All correct there. Everything accordant there." He did not go so far as to say for her pleasure that there was a sort of divine right there, but I have heard claims almost as magnificent of late years. They were now in the back by-road near the place, and the hands were crowding in. The bell was ringing, and the serpent was a serpent of many coils, and the elephant was getting ready. The strange old woman was delighted with the very bell. It was the beautifullest bell she had ever heard, she said, and sounded grand. She asked him, when he stopped good-naturedly to shake hands with her before going in, how long he had worked there. "A dozen year," he told her. "I must kiss the hand," said she, "that has worked in this fine factory for a dozen year." And she lifted it, though he would have prevented her, and put it to her lips. What harmony besides her age and her simplicity surrounded her he did not know, but even in this fantastic action there was a something neither out of time nor place, a something which it seemed as if nobody else could have made as serious, or done with such a natural and touching air. He had been at his loom full half an hour, thinking about this old woman, when, having occasion to move round the loom for its adjustment, he glanced through a window which was in his corner, and saw her still looking up at the pile of building, lost in admiration. Heedless of the smoke and mud and wet, and of her too long journey, she was gazing at it, as if the heavy thrum that issued from its many stories were proud music to her. She was gone by and by, and the day went after her, and the lights sprung up again, and the express whirled in full sight of the fairy palace over the arches near, little felt amid the jarring of the machinery, and scarcely heard above its crash and rattle. Long before then his thoughts had gone back to the dreary room above the little shop, and to the shameful figure heavy on the bed, but heavier on his heart. Machinery slackened, throbbing feebly like a fainting pulse. Stopped. The bell again, the glare of light and heat dispelled, the factories looming heavy in the black wet night, their tall chimneys rising up into the air like competing towers of Babel. He had spoken to Rachael only last night, it was true, and had walked with her a little way, but he had his new misfortune on him in which no one else could give him a moment's relief, and for the sake of it, and because he knew himself to want that softening of his anger which no voice but hers could effect, he felt he might so far disregard what she had said as to wait for her again. He waited, but she had eluded him. She was gone. On no other night in the year could he so ill have spared her patient face. Oh, better to have no home in which to lay his head, than to have a home and dread to go to it through such a cause. He ate and drank, for he was exhausted, but he little knew or cared what, and he wandered about in the chill rain, thinking and thinking, and brooding and brooding. No word of a new marriage had ever passed between them, but Rachael had taken great pity on him years ago, and to her alone he had opened his closed heart all this time, on the subject of his miseries, and he knew very well that if he were free to ask her, she would take him. He thought of the home he might at that moment have been seeking with pleasure and pride, of the different man he might have been that night, of the lightness then in his now heavy-laden breast, of the then restored honour, self-respect, and tranquillity, all torn to pieces. He thought of the waste of the best part of his life, of the change it made in his character for the worst every day, of the dreadful nature of his existence, bound hand and foot to a dead woman, and tormented by a demon in her shape. He thought of Rachael, how young when they were first brought together in these circumstances, how mature now, how soon to grow old. He thought of the number of girls and women she had seen marry, how many homes with children in them she had seen grow up around her, how she had contentedly pursued her own lone quiet path, for him, and how he had sometimes seen a shade of melancholy on her blessed face, that smote him with remorse and despair. He set the picture of her up beside the infamous image of last night, and thought, Could it be that the whole earthly course of one so gentle, good, and self-denying, was subjugate to such a wretch as that? Filled with these thoughts, so filled that he had an unwholesome sense of growing larger, of being placed in some new and diseased relation towards the objects among which he passed, of seeing the iris round every misty light turn red, he went home for shelter. End of Section 6.
Section 7 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, Chapter 13. Rachel. A candle faintly burned in the window to which the black ladder had often been raised for the sliding away of all that was most precious in this world to a striving wife and a brood of hungry babies, and Stephen added to his other thoughts the stern reflection that of all the casualties of his existence upon earth, not one was dealt out with so unequal a hand as death. The inequality of birth was nothing to it, for say that the child of a king and the child of a weaver were born tonight in the same moment. What was that disparity to the death of any human creature who was serviceable to or beloved by another, while this abandoned woman lived on? From the outside of his house he gloomily passed to the inside with suspended breath, and with a slow footstep. He went up to his door, opened it, and so into the room. Quiet and peace were there. Rachel was there, sitting by the bed. She turned her head, and the light of her face shone in upon the midnight of his mind. She sat by the bed, watching and tending his wife. That is to say, he saw that someone lay there, and he knew too well it must be she. But Rachel's hands had put a curtain up so that she was screened from his eyes. Her disgraceful garments were removed, and some of Rachel's were in the room. Everything was in its place and order as he'd always kept it. The little fire was newly trimmed, and the hearth was freshly swept. It appeared to him that he saw all this in Rachel's face, and looked at nothing besides. While looking at it, it was shut out from his view by the softened tears that filled his eyes, but not before he had seen how earnestly she looked at him, and how her own eyes were filled too. She turned again towards the bed, and, satisfying herself that all was quiet there, spoke in a low, calm, cheerful voice. "I'm glad you have come at last, Stephen. You are very late." "I have been walking up and down." "I thought so. But 'tis too bad a night for that. The rain falls very heavy, and the wind has risen." The wind? True. It was blowing hard. Hark to the thundering in the chimney and the surging noise. To have been out in such a wind and not to have known it was blowing. "I have been here once before today, Stephen. Landlady came round for me at dinner time. There was someone here that needed looking to, she said. Indeed, she was right. All wandering and lost, Stephen. Wounded too, and bruised." He slowly moved to a chair and sat down, drooping his head before her. "I came to do what little I could, Stephen. First, for that she worked with me when we were girls both, and for that you courted her and married her when I was her friend." He laid his furrowed forehead on his hand with a low groan. "And next, for that I know your heart, and am right sure and certain that 'tis far too merciful to let her die, or even so much as suffer for want of aid. Thou knowest who said, 'Let him who is without sin amongst you cast the first stone at her.' There have been plenty to do that. Thou art not a man to cast the last stone, Stephen, when she is brought so low." "Oh, Rachel, Rachel!" "Thou hast been a cruel sufferer, heaven reward thee," she said in compassionate accents. "I am thy poor friend with all my heart and mind." The wounds of which she had spoken seemed to be about the neck of the self-made outcast. She dressed them now, still without showing her. She steeped a piece of linen in a basin, into which she poured some liquid from a bottle, and laid it with a gentle hand upon the sore. The three-legged table had been drawn close to the bedside, and on it there were 2 bottles. This was one. It was not so far off but that Stephen, following her hands with his eyes, could read what was printed on it in large letters. He turned of a deadly hue, and a sudden horror seemed to fall upon him. "I will stay here, Stephen," said Rachael, quietly resuming her seat, "till the bells go 3. 'Tis to be done again at 3, and then she may be left till morning." "But thy rest again tomorrow's work, my dear." "I slept sound last night. I can wake many nights when I am put to it. 'Tis thou who art in need of rest, so white and tired. Try to sleep in the chair there while I watch. Thou hadst no sleep last night, I can well believe. Tomorrow's work is far harder for thee than for me." He heard the thundering and surging out of doors, and it seemed to him as if his late angry mood were going about trying to get at him. She had cast it out. She would keep it out. He trusted to her to defend him from himself. "She don't know me, Stephen. She just drowsily mutters and stares. I've spoken to her at time and again, but she don't notice. 'Tis well so. When she comes to her right mind once more, I shall have done what I can, and she never the wiser." "How long, Rachael, is't looked for that she'll be so?" "Doctor said she would happily come to her mind tomorrow." His eyes again fell on the bottle, and a tremble passed over him, causing him to shiver in every limb. She thought he was chilled with the wet. "No," he said, "it was not that. He'd had a fright." "A fright?" "Aye, coming in. When I were walking, when I were thinking, when I—" It seized him again, and he stood up, holding by the mantel-shelf, as he pressed his dank, cold hair down with a hand that shook as if it were palsied. "Stephen!" She was coming to him, but he stretched out his arm to stop her. "No, don't, please, don't. Let me see thee sitting by the bed. Let me see thee so good and so forgiving. Let me see thee as I see thee when I come in. I can never see thee better than so. Never, never, never." He had a violent fit of trembling, and then sunk into his chair. After a time he controlled himself, and, resting with an elbow on one knee and his head upon that hand, he could look toward Rachael's. Seen across the dim candle with his moistened eyes, she looked as if she had a glory shining round her head. He could have believed she had. He did believe it, as the noise without shook the window, rattled at the door below, and went about the house clamouring and lamenting. "When she gets better, Stephen, 'tis to be hoped she'll leave thee to thyself again, and do thee no more hurt. Anyways, we will hope so now. And now I shall keep silence, for I want thee to sleep." He closed his eyes, more to please her than to rest his weary head. But by slow degrees, as he listened to the great noise of the wind, he ceased to hear it, or it changed into the working of his loom, or even into the voices of the day, his own included, saying what had been really said. Even this imperfect consciousness faded away at last, and he dreamed a long, troubled dream. He thought that he and someone on whom his heart had long been set, but she was not Rachael, and that surprised him, even in the midst of his imaginary happiness, stood in the church being married. While the ceremony was performing, and while he recognized among the witnesses some whom he knew to be living, and many of whom he knew to be dead, Darkness came on, succeeded by the shining of a tremendous light. It broke from one line in the table of commandments at the altar, and illuminated the building with the words. They were sounded through the church, too, as if they were voices in the fiery letters. Upon this the whole appearance before him and around him changed, and nothing was left as it had been but himself and the clergyman. They stood in the daylight before a crowd so vast that if all the people in the world could have been brought together into one space, they could not have looked, he thought, more numerous, and they all abhorred him, and there was not one pitying or friendly eye among the millions that were fastened on his face. He stood on a raised stage under his own loom, and, looking up at the shape the loom took, and hearing the burial service distinctly read, he knew that he was there to suffer death. In an instant what he stood on fell below him, and he was gone. Out of what mystery he came back to his usual life and to places that he knew, he was unable to consider. But he was back in those places by some means, and with this condemnation upon him that he was never in this world or the next, through all the unimaginable ages of eternity, to look on Rachael's face or hear her voice. Wandering to and fro unceasingly without hope, and in search of he knew not what, he only knew that he was doomed to seek it, he was the subject of a nameless, horrible dread, a mortal fear of one particular shape which everything took. Whatsoever he looked at grew into that form sooner or later. The object of his miserable existence was to prevent its recognition by any one among the various people he encountered. Hopeless labour. If he led them out of rooms where it was, if he shut up drawers in closets where it stood, if he drew the curious from places where he knew it would be secreted, and got them out into the streets, the very chimneys of the mills assumed that shape, and round them was the printed word. The wind was blowing again, the rain was beating on the housetops, and the larger spaces through which he had strayed contracted to the four walls of his room. Saving that the fire had died out, it was as his eyes had closed upon it. Rachael seemed to have fallen into a doze in the chair by the bed. She sat wrapped in her shawl, perfectly still. The table stood in the same place, close by the bedside, and on it, in its real proportions and appearance, was a shape so often repeated. He thought he saw the curtain move. He looked again, and he was sure it moved. He saw a hand come forth and grope about a little. Then the curtain moved more perceptibly, and the woman in the bed put it back and sat up. With her woeful eyes so haggard and wild, so heavy and large, she looked all round the room, and past the corner where he slept in his chair. Her eyes returned to that corner, and she put her hand over them as a shade while she looked into it. Again they went all round the room, scarcely heeding Rachael, if at all, and returned to that corner. He thought, as she once more shaded them, not so much looking at him as looking for him, with a brutish instinct that he was there, that no single trace was left in those debauched features, or in the mind that went along with them, of the woman he had married 18 years before, but that he had seen her come to this by inches. He never could have believed her to be the same. All this time, as if a spell were on him, he was motionless and powerless, except to watch her. Stupidly dozing or communing with her incapable self, but nothing, she sat for a little while with her hands at her ears and her head resting on them. Presently she resumed her staring round the room, and now for the first time her eyes stopped at the table with the bottles on it. Straightway she turned her eyes back to his corner with the defiance of last night, and moving very cautiously and softly, stretched out her greedy hand. She drew a mug into the bed and sat for a while considering which of the two bottles she should choose. Finally, she laid her insensate grasp upon the bottle that had swift and certain death in it, and before his eyes pulled out the cork with her teeth. Dream or reality, he had no voice, nor had he the power to stir. If this be real, and her allotted time be not yet come, wake, Rachael, wake. She thought of that too. She looked at Rachael, and very slowly, very cautiously, poured out the contents. The draught was at her lips. A moment and she would be past all help. Let the whole world wake and come about her with its utmost power. But in that moment Rachael stirred and started up with a suppressed cry. The creature struggled, struck her, seized her by the hair, but Rachael had the cup. Stephen broke out of his chair. "Rachael, am I waking or dreaming this dreadful night?" "'Tis all well, Stephen. I have been asleep myself. 'Tis near 3. Hush, I hear the bells." The wind had brought the sounds of the church clock to the window. They listened, and it struck 3. Stephen looked at her, saw how pale she was, noted the disorder of her hair and the red marks of fingers on her forehead. He felt assured that his senses of sight and hearing had been awake. She held the cup in her hand even now. "I thought it must be near 3, she said calmly, pouring from the cup into the basin and steeping the linen as before. "I am thankful I stayed. 'Tis done now, and I have put this on. There, and now she's quiet again. The few drops in the basin I'll pour away, for 'tis bad stuff to leave about, though ever so little of it." As she spoke, she drained the basin into the ashes of the fire, and broke the bottle on the hearth. She had nothing to do then but to cover herself with her shawl before going out into the wind and rain. "Thou let me walk with thee at this hour, Rachael?" "No, Stephen. 'Tis but a minute, and I am home." "Thou'rt no fearful," he said in a low voice, as they went out at the door, "to leave me alone with her?" As she looked at him, saying, "Stephen," he went down on his knee before her on the poor mean stairs, and put an end of her shawl to his lips. "Thou art an angel. Bless thee, bless thee." "I am as I have told thee, Stephen, thy poor friend." "Angels are not like me. Between them and a working woman full of faults there is a deep gulf set. My little sister is among them, but she is changed." She raised her eyes for a moment as she said the words, and then they fell again in all their gentleness and mildness on his face. "Thou changest me from bad to good. Thou makest me humbly wishful to be more like thee, and fearful to lose thee when this life is our, and a muddle cleared away. Thou art an angel. It may be thou hast saved my soul alive." She looked at him on his knee at her feet, with her shawl still in his hand, and the reproof on her lips died away when she saw the working of his face. "I come home desperate. I come home without a hope, and mad with thinking that when I said a word or complaint I was reckoned a unreasonable hand. I told thee I had had a fright. It was the poison bottle on the table. I never hurt a living creature, but happening so suddenly upon it, I throwed. How can I say what I might have done to myself or her, or both?" She put her 2 hands on his mouth, with a face of terror, to stop him from saying more. He caught them in his unoccupied hand, and holding them, and still clasping the border of her shawl, said hurriedly, "But I see thee, Rachael, setting by the bed, and I ha' seen thee all this night in my troublous sleep, and I had known thee still to be there. Evermore I will see thee there. I never more will see her or think of her, but thou shalt be beside her. I never more will see or think of anything that angers me, but thou art so much better than me shalt be by the side on't. And so I will try to look to the time, and so I will try to trust in the time when thou and me at last shall walk together far awa, beyond the deep gulf in the country where thy little sister is. He kissed the border of her shawl again, and let her go. She bade him good night in a broken voice, and went out into the street. The wind blew from the quarter where the day would soon appear, and still blew strongly. It had cleared the sky before it, and the rain had spent itself, or travelled elsewhere, and the stars were bright. He stood bareheaded in the road, watching her quick disappearance. As the shining stars were to the heavy candle in the window, so was Rachel in the rugged fancy of this man to the common experiences of his life. Chapter 14. The Great Manufacturer. Time went on in Coketown like its own machinery, so much material wrought up, so much fuel consumed, so many powers worn out, so much money made, but less inexorable than iron, steel, and brass. It brought its varying seasons even into that wilderness of smoke and brick, and made the only stand that was ever made in the place against its direful uniformity. "Louisa is becoming," said Mr. Gradgrind, "almost a young woman." Time, with his innumerable horsepower, worked away, not minding what anybody said, and presently turned out young Thomas, a foot taller than when his father had last taken particular notice of him. "Thomas is becoming," said Mr. Gradgrind, "almost a young man." Time passed Thomas on in the mill, while his father was thinking about it, and there he stood in a long-tailed coat and a stiff shirt-collar. "Really," said Mr. Gradgrind, "the period has arrived when Thomas ought to go to Bounderby." Time, sticking to him, passed him on into Bounderby's bank, made him an inmate of Bounderby's house, necessitated the purchase of his first razor, and exercised him diligently in his calculations relative to number 1. The same great manufacturer, always with an immense variety of work on hand in every stage of development, passed Sissy onward in his mill, and worked her up into a very pretty article indeed. "I fear, Jupe," said Mr. Gradgrind, "that your continuance at the school any longer would be useless." "I'm afraid it would, sir," Sissy answered with a curtsy. "I cannot disguise from you, Jupe," said Mr. Gradgrind, knitting his brow, "that the result of your probation there has disappointed me, has greatly disappointed me. You have not acquired, under Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild, anything like that amount of exact knowledge which I looked for. You are extremely deficient in your facts. Your acquaintance with figures is limited. You are altogether backward and below the mark." "I am sorry, sir," she returned, "but I know it is quite true, yet I have tried hard, sir." "Yes," said Mr. Gradgrind, "yes, I believe you have tried hard. I have observed you, and I can find no fault in that respect." "Thank you, sir. I have thought sometimes," Sissy, very timid here, "that perhaps I tried to learn too much, and that if I'd asked to be allowed to try a little less, I might have—" "No, Jupe, no," said Mr. Gradgrind, shaking his head in his profoundest, most eminently practical way. "No. The course you pursued according to the system, and there is no more to be said about it. I can only suppose that the circumstances of your early life were too unfavorable to the development of your reasoning powers, and that we began too late. Still, as I have said already, I am disappointed." "I wish I could have made a better acknowledgment, sir, of your kindness to a poor forlorn girl, who had no claim upon you, and of your protection of her." "Don't shed tears," said Mr. Gradgrind. "Don't shed tears. I don't complain of you. You are an affectionate, earnest, good young woman, and we must make that do." "Thank you, sir, very much," said Sissy, with a grateful curtsy. "You are useful to Mrs. Gradgrind, and, in a generally pervading way, you are serviceable in the family also, so I understand from Miss Louisa, and indeed so I have observed myself. I therefore hope," said Mr. Gradgrind, "that you can make yourself happy in those relations." "I should have nothing to wish, sir, if—" "I understand you," said Mr. Gradgrind. "You still refer to your father. I have heard from Miss Louisa that you still preserve that bottle. Well, if your training in the service of arriving at exact results had been more successful, you would have been wiser on these points. I will say no more." He really liked Sissy too well to have contempt for her. Otherwise, he held her calculating powers in such very slight estimation that he must have fallen upon that conclusion. Somehow or other he had become possessed by an idea that there was something in this girl which could hardly be set forth in a tabular form. Her capacity or definition might be easily stated at a very low figure, her mathematical knowledge at nothing. Yet he was not sure that if he had been required, for example, to take her off into columns in a parliamentary return, he would have quite known how to divide her. In some stages of his manufacture of the human fabric, the processes of time are very rapid. Young Thomas and Sissy being both at such a stage of their working up, these changes were effected in a year or two, while Mr. Gradgrind himself seemed stationary in his course and underwent no alteration. Except one, which was apart from his necessary progress through the mill. Time hustled him into a little noisy, rather dirty machinery in a by-corner, and made him Member of Parliament for Coketown, one of the respected members for ounce weights and measures, one of the representatives of the multiplication table, one of the deaf honourable gentlemen, dumb honourable gentlemen, blind honourable gentlemen, lame honourable gentlemen, dead honourable gentlemen, to every other consideration. Else wherefore live we in a Christian land 1800 and odd years after our master? All this while Louisa had been passing on, so quiet and reserved, and so much given to watching the bright ashes at twilight as they fell from the grate and become extinct, that from the period when her father had said she was almost a young woman, which seemed but yesterday, she had scarcely attracted his notice again, when he found her quite a young woman. "Quite a young woman," said Mr. Gradgrind, musing. "Dear me!" Soon after this discovery he became more thoughtful than usual for several days, and seemed much engrossed by one subject. On a certain night, when he was going out, and Louisa came to bid him good-bye before his departure, as he was not to be home until late, and she would not see him again until the morning, he held her in his arms, looking at her in his kindest manner, and said, "My dear Louisa, you are a woman." She answered with an odd, quick, searching look of the night when she was found at the circus, then cast down her eyes. "Yes, father." "My dear," said Mr. Gradgrind, "I must speak with you alone and seriously." come to me in my room after breakfast tomorrow, will you?" "Yes, father." "Your hands are rather cold, Louisa. Are you not well?" "Quite well, father." "And cheerful?" She looked at him again and smiled in her peculiar manner. "I am as cheerful, father, as I usually am, or usually have been." "Ah, that's well," said Mr. Gradgrind. So he kissed her and went away, and Louisa returned to the serene apartment of the hair-cutting character, and, leaning her elbow on her hand, looked again at the short-lived sparks that soon subsided into ashes. "Are you there, Lou?" said her brother, looking in at the door. He was quite a young gentleman of pleasure now, and not quite prepossessing one. "Dear Tom," she answered, rising and embracing him, "how long it is since you have been to see me!" "Why, I have been otherwise engaged, Lou. In the evenings and in the daytime old Bounderby has been keeping me at it rather, but I touch him up with you when he comes it too strong, and so we preserve an understanding. I say, has father said anything in particular to you today or yesterday, Lou?" "No, Tom, but he told me tonight that he wished to do so in the morning." "Ah, that's what I mean," said Tom. "Do you know where he is tonight?" With a very deep expression. "No." "Then I'll tell you. He's with old Bounderby. They are having a regular confab together at the bank." "Why at the bank, do you think?" "Well, I'll tell you again. To keep Mrs. Sparsit's ears as far off as possible, I expect." With her hand upon her brother's shoulder, Louisa stood looking at the fire. Her brother glanced at her face with greater interest than usual, and, encircling her waist with his arm, drew her coaxingly to him. "You are very fond of me, ain't you, Lou?" "I am indeed, Tom, though you do let such long intervals go by without coming to see me." "Well, sister of mine," said Tom, "when you say that, you are near my thoughts. We might be so much oftener together, mightn't we? Always together, almost, mightn't we? It would do me a great deal of good if you were to make up your mind to I know what, Lou. It would be a splendid thing for me. It would be uncommonly jolly." Her thoughtfulness baffled his cunning scrutiny. He could make nothing of her face. He pressed her in his arm and kissed her cheek. She returned the kiss, but still looked at the fire. "I say, Lou, I thought I'd come and just hint to you what was going on, though I suppose you'd most likely guess, even if you didn't know. I can't stay, because I'm engaged to some fellows tonight. You won't forget how fond you are of me?" "No, dear Tom, I won't forget." "That's a capital girl," said Tom. "Good-bye, Lou." She gave him an affectionate good night, and went out with him to the door, whence the fires of Coketown could be seen, making the distance lurid. She stood there looking steadfastly towards them, and listening to his departing steps. They retreated quickly, as glad to get away from Stone Lodge as she stood there yet, when he was gone and all was quiet. It seemed as if, first in her own fire within the house, and then in the fiery haze without, she tried to discover what kind of woof old Time, that greatest and longest established spinner of all, would weave from the threads he had already spun into a woman. But his factory is a secret place, his work is noiseless, and his hands are mutes. End of section 7 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Section 8 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, Chapter 15. Father and Daughter. Although Mr. Gradgrind did not take after Bluebeard, his room was quite a blue chamber in its abundance of blue books. Whatever they could prove, which is usually anything you like, they proved there in an army constantly strengthening by the arrival of new recruits. In that charm department, the most complicated social questions were cast up, got into exact totals, and finally settled, if those concerned could only have been brought to know it. As if an astronomical observatory should be made without any windows, and the astronomer within should arrange the starry universe solely by pen and ink and paper, so Mr. Gradgrind in his observatory, and there are many like it, had no need to cast an eye upon the teeming myriads of human beings around him, but could settle all their destinies on a slate, and wipe out all their tears with one dirty little bit of sponge. To this observatory, then, a stern room with a deadly statistical clock in it which measured every second with a beat like a rap upon a coffin lid, Louisa repaired on the appointed morning. A window looked towards Coketown, and when she sat down near her father's table she saw the high chimneys and the long tracks of smoke looming in the heavy distance gloomily. "My dear Louisa," said her father, "I prepared you last night to give me your serious attention in the conversation we are now going to have together. You have been so well trained, and you do, I am happy to say, so much justice to the education you have received, that I have perfect confidence in your good sense. You are not impulsive, you are not romantic. You are accustomed to view everything from the strong, dispassionate ground of reason and calculation. From that ground alone, I know you will view and consider what I am going to communicate." He waited as if he would have been glad that she said something, but she said never a word. "Louisa, my dear, you are the subject of a proposal of marriage that has been made to me." Again he waited, and again she answered not one word. This so far surprised him as to induce him gently to repeat, "A proposal of marriage, my dear," to which she returned without any visible emotion whatever. "I hear you, father. I am attending, I assure you." "Well," said Mr. Gradgrind, breaking into a smile after being for a moment at a loss, "you are even more dispassionate than I expected, Louisa, or perhaps you are not unprepared for the announcement I have it in my charge to make." "I cannot say that, father, until I hear it, prepared or unprepared. I wish to hear it all from you. I wish to hear you state it to me, father." Strange to relate, Mr. Gradgrind was not so collected at this moment as his daughter was. He took a paper knife in his hand, turned it over, laid it down, took it up again, and even then had to look along the blade of it, considering how to go on. "What you say, my dear Louisa, is perfectly reasonable. I have undertaken, then, to let you know that, in short, Mr. Bounderby has informed me that he has long watched your progress with particular interest and pleasure, and has long hoped that the time might ultimately arrive when he should offer you his hand in marriage. That time, to which he has so long, and certainly with great constancy, looked forward, is now come. Mr. Bounderby has made his proposal of marriage to me, and has entreated me to make it known to you, and to express his hope that you will take it into your favourable consideration." Silence between them. The deadly statistical clock very hollow, the distant smoke very black and heavy. "Father," said Louisa, "do you think I love Mr. Bounderby?" Mr. Gradgrind was extremely discomfited by this unexpected question. "Well, my child," he returned, "I really cannot take upon myself to say." "Father," pursued Louisa, in exactly the same voice as before, "do you ask me to love Mr. Bounderby?" "My dear Louisa, no, I ask nothing." "Father," she still pursued, "does Mr. Bounderby ask me to love him?" "Really, my dear," said Mr. Gradgrind, "it is difficult to answer your question." "Difficult to answer it, yes or no, father?" "Certainly, my dear, because—" Here was something to demonstrate, and it set him up again. "Because the reply depends so materially, Louisa, on the sense in which we use the expression. Now, Mr. Bounderby does not do you the injustice, and does not do himself the injustice, of pretending to anything fanciful, fantastic, or, I'm using synonymous terms, sentimental. Mr. Bounderby would have seen you grow up under his eyes to a very little purpose, if he could so far forget what is due to your good sense, not to say to his, as to address you from any such ground. Therefore, perhaps, the expression itself, I merely suggest this to you, my dear, may be a little misplaced." "What would you advise me to use in its stead, father?" "Why, my dear Louisa," said Mr. Gradgrind, completely recovered by this time, "I would advise you, since you ask me, to consider this question as you have been accustomed to consider every other question, simply as one of tangible fact. The ignorant and the giddy may embarrass such subjects with irrelevant fancies and other absurdities that have no existence properly viewed, really no existence, but it is no compliment to you to say that you know better. Now, what the facts are in this case, you are, we will say in round numbers, 20 years of age. Mr. Bounderby is, we will say in round numbers, 50. There is some disparity in your respective years, but in your means and positions there is none. On the contrary, there is a great suitability. Then the question arises, is this one disparity sufficient to operate as a bar to such a marriage? In considering this question, it is not unimportant to take into account the statistics of marriage, so far as they have yet been obtained in England and Wales. I find, on reference to the figures, that a large proportion of these marriages are contracted between parties of very unequal ages, and that the elder of these contracting parties is, in rather more than 3/4 of these instances, the bridegroom. It is remarkable, as showing the wide prevalence of this law, that among the natives of the British possessions in India, also in a considerable part of China, and among the Kalmucks in Tartary, the best means of computation yet furnished us by travellers yield similar results. The disparity I have mentioned, therefore, almost ceases to be disparity, and virtually all but disappears. "What do you recommend, father?" asked Louisa, her reserved composure not in the least affected by these gratifying results. "That I should substitute for the term I used just now, for the misplaced expression?" "Louisa," returned her father, "it appears to me that nothing can be plainer. Confining yourself rigidly to fact, the question of fact, you state to yourself, is, does Mr. Bounderby ask me to marry him? Yes, he does. The sole remaining question then is, shall I marry him? I think nothing can be plainer than that." "Shall I marry him?" repeated Louisa, with great deliberation. Precisely, and it is satisfactory to me as your father, my dear Louisa, to know that you do not come to the consideration of that question with the previous habits of mind and habits of life that belong to many young women. No, father, she returned, I do not. I leave you to judge for yourself, said Mr. Gradgrind. I have stated the case as such cases are usually stated among practical minds. I have stated it as the case of your mother and myself was stated in its time. The rest, my dear Louisa, is for you to decide. From the beginning she had sat looking at him fixedly. As he now leaned back in his chair and bent his deep-set eyes upon her in his turn, perhaps he might have seen one wavering moment in her, when she was impelled to throw herself upon his breast and give him the pent-up confidences of her heart. But to see it he must have overleaped at a bound the artificial barriers he had for many years been erecting between himself and all those subtle essences of humanity which will elude the utmost cunning of algebra until the last trumpet ever to be sounded shall blow even algebra to wreck. The barriers were too many and too high for such a leap. With his unbending, utilitarian, matter-of-fact face, he hardened her again, and moment shot away into the plumbless depths of the past to mingle with all the lost opportunities that are drowned there. Removing her eyes from him, she sat so long looking silently towards the town that he said at length, "Are you consulting the chimneys of Coketown works, Louisa?" "Well, there seems to be nothing there but languid and monotonous smoke. Yet when night comes, fire bursts out, father," she answered, turning quickly. "Well, of course I know that, Louisa. I do not see the application of that remark." To do him justice, he did not at all. She passed it away with a slight motion of her hand, and concentrating her attention upon him again, said, "Father, I have often thought that life is very short." This was so distinctly one of his subjects that he interposed. "It is short, no doubt, my dear. Still, the average duration of human life is proved to have increased of late years, and the calculations of various life assurance and annuity offices, among other figures which cannot go wrong, have established the fact." "I speak of my own life, father." "Oh, indeed. Still," said Mr. Gradgrind, "I need not point out to you, Louisa, that it is governed by the laws which govern lives in the aggregate." "Whilst it lasts, I would wish to do the little I can, and the little I am fit for. What does it matter?" Mr. Gradgrind seemed rather at a loss to understand the last 4 words, replying, "How matter? What matter, my dear?" "Mr. Bounderby," she went on, in a steady, straight way, without regarding this, "asks me to marry him. The question I have to ask myself is, shall I marry him? That is so, father, is it not? You have told me so, father, have you not?" "Certainly, my dear." "Let it be so. Since Mr. Bounderby likes to take me thus, I am satisfied to accept his proposal. Tell him, father, as soon as you please, that this was my answer. Repeat it word for word, if you can, because I should wish him to know what I said." "Oh, it is quite right, my dear," retorted her father approvingly. "To be exact, I will observe your very proper request. Have you any wish in reference to the period of your marriage, my child?" "None, father. What does it matter?" Mr. Gradgrind had drawn his chair a little nearer to her, and taken her hand. But her repetition of these words seemed to strike with some little discord on his ear. He paused to look at her, and, still holding her hand, said, "Louisa, I have not considered it essential to ask you one question, because the possibility implied in it appeared to me to be too remote. But perhaps I ought to do so. You have never entertained in secret any other proposal?" "Father," she returned, almost scornfully, "what other proposal can have been made to me? Whom have I seen? Where have I been? What are my heart's experiences?" "My dear Louisa," returned Mr. Gradgrind, reassured and satisfied, "you correct me justly. I merely wish to discharge my duty." "What do I know, father," said Louisa in her quiet manner, "of tastes and fantasies, of aspirations and affections, of all that part of my nature in which such light things might have been nourished? What escape have I had from problems that could be demonstrated, and realities that could be grasped?" As she said it, she unconsciously closed her hand as if upon a solid object, and slowly opened it as though she were releasing dust or ash. "My dear," assented her eminently practical parent, "quite true, quite true." "Why, father," she pursued, "what a strange question to ask me! The baby preference that even I have heard of as common among children has never had its innocent resting place in my breast. You have been so careful of me that I never had a child's heart. You have trained me so well that I never dreamed a child's dream. You have dealt so wisely with me, father, from my cradle to this hour, that I have never had a child's belief or a child's fear." Mr. Gradgrind was quite moved by his success, and by this testimony to it. "My dear Louisa," said he, "you abundantly repay my care. Kiss me, my dear girl." So his daughter kissed him. Detaining her in his embrace, he said, "I may assure you now, my favourite child, that I am made happy by the sound decision at which you have arrived. Mr. Bounderby is a very remarkable man, and what little disparity can be said to exist between you, if any, is more than counterbalanced by the tone your mind has acquired. It has always been my object so to educate you as that you might, while still in your early youth, be, if I may so express myself, almost any age. Kiss me once more, Louisa. Now let us go and find your mother." Accordingly, they went down to the drawing room, where the esteemed lady, with no nonsense about her, was recumbent as usual, while Sissy worked beside her. She gave some feeble signs of returning animation when they entered, and presently the faint transparency was presented in a sitting attitude. "Mrs. Gradgrind," said her husband, who had waited for the achievement of this feat with some impatience, "allow me to present you Mrs. Bounderby." "Oh," said Mrs. Gradgrind, "so you have settled it. Well, I'm sure I hope your health may be good, Louisa, for if your head begins to split as soon as you are married, which was the case with mine, I cannot consider that you are to be envied, though I have no doubt you think you are, as all girls do. However, I give you joy, my dear, and I hope you may now turn all your logical studies to good account." "I'm sure I do. I must give you a kiss of congratulation, Louisa, but don't touch my right shoulder, for there's something running down it all day long." "And now you see," whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, adjusting her shawls after the affectionate ceremony, "I shall be worrying myself morning, noon, and night to know what I am to call him." "Mrs. Gradgrind," said her husband solemnly, "what do you mean?" "Whatever I am to call him, Mr. Gradgrind, when he is married to Louisa. I must call him something. It's impossible," said Mrs. Gradgrind, with a mingled sense of politeness and injury, "to be constantly addressing him and never giving him a name. I cannot call him Josiah, for the name is insupportable to me. You yourself wouldn't hear of Joe, you very well know. Am I to call my own son-in-law Mister? Not that I believe, unless the time has arrived when, as an invalid, I am to be trampled upon by my relations. Then what am I to call him?" Nobody present having any suggestion to offer in the remarkable emergency, Mrs. Gradgrind departed this life for the time being, after delivering the following codicil to her remarks already executed. "As to the wedding, all I ask, Louisa, is, and I ask it with a flutter in my chest, what actually extends to the soles of my feet, that it may take place soon. Otherwise, I know it is one of those subjects I shall never hear the last of." When Mr. Gradgrind had presented Mrs. Bounderby, Sissy had suddenly turned her head and looked in wonder, in pity, in sorrow, in doubt, in a multitude of emotions toward Louisa. Louisa had known it and seen it without looking at her. From that moment she was impassive, proud, and cold, held Sissy at a distance, changed to her altogether. Chapter 16. Husband and Wife. Mr. Bounderby's first disquietude on hearing of his happiness was occasioned by the necessity of imparting it to Mrs. Sparsit. He could not make up his mind how to do that, or what the consequences of the step might be. Whether she would instantly depart, bag and baggage, to Lady Scadger's, or would possibly refuse to budge from the premises, whether she would be plaintive or abusive, tearful or tearing, whether she would break her heart or break the looking-glass, Mr. Bounderby could not at all foresee. However, as it must be done, he had no choice but to do so. So, after attempting several letters and failing in them all, he resolved to do it by word of mouth. On his way home on the evening he set aside for this momentous purpose, he took the precaution of stepping into a chemist's shop and buying a bottle of the very strongest smelling salts. "By George," said Mr. Bounderby, "if she takes it in the fainting way, I'll have the skin off her nose at all events." But in spite of being thus forearmed, he entered his own house with anything but a courageous air, and appeared before the object of his misgivings like a dog who was conscious of coming direct from the pantry. "Good evening, Mr. Bounderby." "Good evening, ma'am, good evening." He drew up his chair, and Mrs. Sparsit drew back hers, as who should say, "Your fireside, sir, I freely admit it. It is for you to occupy it all, if you think proper." "Oh, well, don't go to the North Pole, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby. "Thank you, sir," said Mrs. Sparsit, and returned, though short of her former position. Mr. Bounderby sat looking at her as, with the points of a stiff, sharp pair of scissors, she picked out holes from some inscrutable ornamental purpose in a piece of cambric, an operation which, taken in connection with the bushy eyebrows and the Roman nose, suggested with some liveliness the idea of a hawk engaged upon the eyes of a tough little bird. She was so steadfastly occupied that many minutes elapsed before she looked up from her work. When she did so, Mr. Bounderby bespoke her attention with a hitch of his head. "Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets, and assuring himself with his right hand that the cork of the little bottle was ready for use, "I have on occasion to say to you that you are not only a lady born and bred, but a devilish sensible woman." "Sir," returned the lady, "this is indeed not the first time that you have honoured me with similar expressions of your good opinion." "Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby, "I am going to astonish you." "Yes, sir," returned Mrs. Sparsit interrogatively, and in the most tranquil manner possible. She generally wore mittens, and she now laid down her work and smoothed those mittens. "I am going, ma'am," said Mr. Bounderby, "to marry Tom Gradgrind's daughter." "Yes, sir," returned Mrs. Sparsit. "I hope you may be happy, Mr. Bounderby." "Oh, indeed, I hope you may be happy, sir." and she said it with such great condescension, as well as with such great compassion for him, that Bounderby, far more disconcerted than if she had thrown her work-box at the mirror, or swooned on the hearth-rug, corked up the smelling salts tight in his pocket, and thought, "Now, confound this woman! Who could have ever guessed that she would take it in this way?" "I wish with all my heart, sir," said Mrs. Sparsit, in a highly superior manner. Somehow she seemed, in a moment, to have established a right to pity him ever afterwards, "that you may be, in all respects, very happy." "Well, ma'am," returned Bounderby, with some resentment in his tone, which was clearly lowered, though in spite of himself, "I am obliged to you. I hope I shall be." "Do you, sir?" said Mrs. Sparsit, with great affability. "But naturally you do. Of course you do." A very awkward pause on Mr. Bounderby's part succeeded. Mrs. Sparsit sedately resumed her work, and occasionally gave a small cough, which sounded like the cough of conscious strength and forbearance. "Well, ma'am," resumed Mr. Bounderby, "under these circumstances, I imagine it would not be agreeable to a character like yours to remain here, though you would be very welcome here." "Oh dear, no, sir. I could on no account think of that." Mrs. Sparsit shook her head, still in her highly superior manner, and a little changed the small cough, coughing now as if the spirit of prophecy rose within her, but had better be coughed down. "However, ma'am," said Bounderby, "there are apartments at the Bank, where a born and bred lady, as keeper of the place, would be rather a catch than otherwise, and if the same terms—" "I beg your pardon, sir?" "You were so good as to promise that you would always substitute the phrase annual compliment." "Well, ma'am, annual compliment, if the same annual compliment would be acceptable there, why, I see nothing to part us, unless you do." "Sir," returned Mrs. Sparsit, "the proposal is like yourself, and if the position I shall assume at the Bank is one that I could occupy without descending lower in the social scale—" "Why, of course it is," said Bounderby. "If it was not, ma'am, you don't suppose that I should offer it to a lady who has moved in the society you have moved in? Not that I care for such society, you know, but you do." "Mr. Bounderby, you are very considerate." "You'll have your own private apartments, and you'll have your coals and your candles and all the rest of it, and you'll have your maid to attend upon you, and you'll have your light porter to protect you, and you'll be what I take the liberty of considering precious comfortable," said Bounderby. "Sir," rejoined Mrs. Sparsit, "say no more. And yielding up my trust here, I shall not be freed from the necessity of eating the bread of dependence." She might have said the sweet bread, for the delicate article in a savoury brown sauce was her favourite supper, "and I would rather receive it from your hand than from any other. Therefore, sir, I accept your offer gratefully, and with many sincere acknowledgments for past favours. And I hope, sir," said Mrs. Sparsit, concluding in an impressively compassionate manner, "I fondly hope that Miss Gradgrind may be all you desire and deserve." Nothing moved Mrs. Sparsit from that position any more. It was in vain for Bounderby to bluster or to assert himself in any of his explosive ways. Mrs. Sparsit was resolved to have compassion on him as a victim. She was polite, obliging, cheerful, hopeful. But the more polite, the more obliging, the more cheerful, the more hopeful, the more exemplary altogether she, for the forlorner sacrifice and victim he, she had that tenderness for his melancholy fate, that his great red countenance used to break out into cold perspirations when she looked at him. Meanwhile, the marriage was appointed to be solemnized in 8 weeks' time, and Mr. Bounderby went every evening to Stone Lodge as an accepted wooer. Love was made on these occasions in the form of bracelets, and on all occasions during the period of betrothal took a manufacturing aspect. Dresses were made, jewellery was made, cakes and gloves were made, settlements were made, and an extensive assortment of facts did appropriate honour to the contract. The business was all fact, from first to last. The hours did not go through any of those rosy performances which foolish poets have ascribed to them at such time. Neither did the clocks go any faster or any slower than at other seasons. The deadly statistical recorder in the Gradgrind observatory knocked every second on the head as it was born, and buried it with his accustomed regularity. So the day came, as all other days come to people who will only stick to reason, and when it came, there were married in the church of the florid wooden legs, that popular order of architecture, Josiah Bounderby, Esquire, of Coketown, to Louisa, eldest daughter of Thomas Gradgrind, Esquire, of Stone Lodge, M.P. for that borough. And when they were united in holy matrimony, they went home to breakfast to Stone Lodge aforesaid. There was an improving party assembled on the auspicious occasion, who knew what everything they had to eat and drink was made of, and how it was imported or exported, and in what quantities, and in what bottoms, whether native or foreign, and all about it. The bridesmaids, down to little Jane Gradgrind, were, in an intellectual point of view, fit helpmates for the calculating boy, and there was no nonsense about any of the company. After breakfast, the bridegroom addressed them in the following terms: "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Since you have done my wife and myself the honour of drinking our healths and happiness, I suppose I must acknowledge the same, though as you all know me and know what I am, and what my extraction was, you won't expect a speech from a man who, when he sees a post, says, 'That's a post,' and when he sees a pump, says, 'That's a pump,' and is not to be got to call a post a pump, or a pump a post, or either of them a toothpick. If you want a speech this morning, my friend and father-in-law, Tom Gradgrind, is a member of Parliament, and you know where to get it. I am not your man. However, if I feel a little independent when I look around this table today, and reflect how little I thought of marrying Tom Gradgrind's daughter when I was a ragged street boy who never washed his face unless it was at a pump, and that's not oftener than once a fortnight, I hope I may be excused. So, I hope you like my feeling independent. If you don't, I can't help it. I do feel independent. Now, I have mentioned, and you have mentioned, that I am this day married to Tom Gradgrind's daughter. I'm very glad to be so. It has long been my wish to be so. I've watched her bringing up, and I believe she is worthy of me. At the same time, not to deceive you, I believe I am worthy of her. So I thank you on both our parts for the good will you have shown towards us, and the best wish I can give the unmarried part of the present company is this: I hope every bachelor may find as good a wife as I have found, and I hope every spinster may find as good a husband as my wife has found." Shortly after which oration, as they were going on a nuptial trip to Lyons, in order that Mr. Bounderby might take the opportunity of seeing how the hands got on in those parts, and whether they, too, required to be fed with gold spoons, the happy pair departed for the railroad. The bride, in passing downstairs, dressed for her journey, found Tom waiting for her, flushed, either with his feeling or the vinous part of the breakfast. "What a game girl you are to be such a first-rate sister, Loo," whispered Tom. She clung to him as she could have clung to some far better nature that day, and was a little shaken in her reserved composure for the first time. "Old Bounderby's quite ready," said Tom. "Time's up. Good-bye. I shall be on the look-out for you when you come back. I say, my dear Loo, ain't it uncommonly jolly now?" End of Section 8 of Hard Times.